mentioned in the invitation for this is meant to be a fairly casual discussion. We have Laura Ross here from UC Irvine. You'll hear more from her later today when she gives a formal lecture. But I thought it would be a good idea, an opportunity as well, just to have an informal discussion with Laura and just to talk about, her ideas about life. It's a small group, so maybe we could do some quick introductions just so that everybody knows who everybody is, and it's an idea kind of what people are working on as well. So I'll leave Laura to last, and she can talk more. But maybe we can start with actually Mike.
Okay, sure. Hi, I'm Michael Macer, and I'm a recent Ph.D. grad, not from neuroscience, but from Faculty of Education just across the hall.
Great. Just pick Jaspreet since you're the largest person on the screen right now.
So I recently graduated from my undergrad this year in June. So I'm just taking a year off to work. I'm working in Randy's lab as a research assistant. I've just been helping with any projects in the lab that need a little bit of support. Hoping to go to grad school next year. Really excited to hear from you.
Phil, please.
Hi, I'm Phil. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Toronto, and I work on MEG and stroke and computational modeling in stroke.
Super, thank you. Jack, please.
Hi, I'm Jack. I recently, last month, finished my PhD at Dalhousie University, and I'm just getting established in this group. So I'm learning the ropes, and it seems like I'm going to be doing a little bit of work in defining some relationships between healthy lifestyle factors and cognitive function over the course of time.
Super. Thanks, Jack. Leanne.
Hi, I'm also a PhD student in Toronto, and I'm working with early development, so fMRI data for children and the virtual brain.
Simon.
Hi, I'm a postdoc in the lab, and I use MEG to study sensory processing in aging and soon in Alzheimer's disease.
Where are you right now, Simon, again?
Oh, I'm actually in Ontario right now at my parents' house.
Okay.
Yeah, I came back for a wedding. Otherwise, I'd be there with you in the room.
It looks too sunny there.
Yeah. The fall in Ontario is much nicer than the fall in Vancouver.
Indeed. Thank you. Josh.
Hi, yeah, I'm Josh. I'm a postdoc in the lab as well, working with the sort of lifespan data set that we have, looking at structural and functional connectivity factors that can aid cognitive ability in older adulthood.
Thanks, Josh. Caitlin, are you able to?
Morning. Hi. Sorry, there's something wrong with my video, but yeah, so I'm a master's student in Randy's lab, and right now we're working on a project for community development or community engagement, sorry. So looking at access to culturally appropriate care for Indigenous groups in relation to Alzheimer's and dementia.
Super, thank you. And then last but not least, Lisa. Hi.
Oops. Sorry, I have a pop-up on my screen.
All good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Julian. I'm assistant professor in biology, and I work on brain development using human stem cells to understand development and in rare disease pathogenesis. Really looking forward to this conversation. I'm sorry to have my screen off. I'm actually in office hours right now, so I'm expecting some students to pop in and out. So we'll listen and chime in when I can.
Super. Thank you, Lisa. Good. Kelly.
Everyone here knows me, probably. I'm Kelly Shen. I am the Senior Program Manager for the Institute for Neuroscience and Neurotechnology.
Good. And then we have our guest, Lauren Ross from UC Irvine. I think what I can do is your introduction we can maybe do in the course of the conversation. But the most important thing I want to ask you, first of all, is what's your favorite soup?
Favorite soup? I got a little bit of a heads up on this question coming. Fortunate because, so if I'm out at a restaurant, my favorite soup is French onion. I think that's going to be the top. If I'm at home making soup, it's red lentil.
Red lentil.
Yes. There it is. It's amazing red lentil soup that I love.
Very
So,
good, very good.
Two-part answer.
You could have French onion last night at beer craft, but probably not actually. We did the beer craft thing last night, sort of obligatory for SFU visit. Great, so the way I think we could run this is I'll just kind of break the ice and get the conversation going. If people want to chime in and ask questions, this is meant to be conversational, so you know, just feel free to interject as necessary. I guess I can start with sort of your sort of career trajectory. If you take a look at your CV, you've got a very interesting sort of transition. And maybe you can just sort of tell us how that sort of evolved and how you ended up sort of at UC Irvine in your current position.
Perfect. There's different lengths with which I could tell the story. So the, I mean, so when I started college, I became pre-med, and then I went to medical school, and then I got my Ph.D. in the history and philosophy of science, and now I'm a philosopher of science in an academic department. It's a logic and philosophy of science department, so that's the kind of overview picture of the steps. And there were a couple transition points, and I can talk about any of them in further detail, but basically when I was a pre-med, well, I became interested in medicine essentially because I shadowed physicians. It took me a little bit of time to figure out that I was interested in medicine. I shadowed dietitians, I shadowed physical therapists, pharmacists, and then watched a couple surgeries and just saw these really fascinating clinical experiences. Yeah, I watched a heart surgery that was just kind of yeah. So got to see a lot of kind of hands-on kind of like day-to-day life of physicians. Became very interested in being a physician pre-med. At the end of my pre-medical education, there was another kind of transition point. So one is like getting interested in medicine. Another was falling a little bit out of favor with the style of education. So I got really good at memorizing lots of stuff and taking tests. And at the very end of pre-med, I applied to medical school, but I was sort of like, you know, do I really know, is this really what it is to understand the world and how science works? And I ended up taking a philosophy class just because I had extra units. And it was a class where the professor had reviews. Half of them were just saying, this is the best class I've ever had in my life, it changed everything. And the other half were, this is terrible, this professor's horrible. So I was sort of like, well, you know, I have extra space in my schedule. I took that class, and that was my first experience with philosophy. It was him critical thinking, it was debates, it was all just, what do you think about this? What's your argument for, you know, this claim? So that was my first kind of taste of philosophy, and that's when I first realized I had an interest, but I got into medical school. Still very interested in medicine. There was no clear way for me to study philosophy, and, you know, I mean, medicine still had my heart. And yeah, so medical school is 4 years, and the first 2 are more like pre-med. It's like books, tests. The latter half is clinical work. And the story you hear in medical school is everyone hates the first 2 years. It's just you're taking tests, but they love the second 2. You put on your little white coat, or, you know, your short white coat. It's shorter than the residence. And once you start your 3rd year, you get to be a doctor, right? Well, I had the opposite experience. The first 2 years, I'm like in heaven. I'm learning all of this anatomy, I'm learning all this physiology, and then when I start the clinical work, this is when I can tell I'm basically like wanting to ask a lot of questions about why are things happening the way they're happening, and that led me to think of philosophy again. Because you really, as a, it's a profession, you need to accept the gold standard to some extent. You kind of can't ask a lot of those questions in the, so then, I mean, this is another transition point and a little bit of a crisis, to be totally honest. When you're halfway through medical school, the last thing you want to think is, is this the career path for me? Yeah. It's a huge investment, and so that's when I started to think, what other career options are available if I wanted them to be. I ended up taking some philosophy classes when I was in medical school, and then I applied to PhD programs. At that point, not knowing what would happen, I knew I didn't know enough about philosophy of science to know if it was for me, and I let myself kind of figure that out more in grad school. So finished the medical degree and started a PhD in history and philosophy of science. And I started this program, and I just fell in love with it. It was there's a sense in which there's a kind of just a feeling of fit, and then there's being able to say why it's a good fit. And I started to have both, but I had to learn a lot. It was I mean, it's totally different to write philosophy papers that engage in philosophical discussions from clinical practice. And then the cultures are different too. In the hospital, there is a hierarchy, and you just can't talk to some people. In academics, in the ideal form of academia, I can tell the top dog they're wrong, and if I have a good argument, like, I'm allowed to do that. Yes. I probably thought that was kind of nice.
Do you think that experience in medicine provides you with a different perspective than some of your colleagues who just gone straight through the traditional sort of PhD route?
Yeah, absolutely. I would never say that if someone wants to do philosophy of medicine or philosophy of science that they should go to medical school first. That's too much. No one would need to do 4 years of medicine to do philosophy of science or philosophy of medicine, but it was hugely informative, very helpful. In my program, you basically have students coming from two main directions. They either come from philosophy and they've got to learn some science, or they come from science and they need to learn philosophy. So I was coming from science and I needed to learn the philosophy. And hugely helpful. The challenges of doing it in this direction are you're dropped in the deep end. You're in a PhD program in philosophy, and I didn't really know how to write philosophy papers. So I had to completely learn how to do that. It also, you might think, would be natural if you're coming from medical school. You've been through so much training that you're sort of like, you're kind of, you're not ready to be humbled at the beginning, the way that you should be and need to be at the beginning of a PhD program. And so, I mean, luckily I think I was prepared for that and kind of ready. But after, for me, 5 years of pre-med, 4 years of medical school, it's like, okay, I need to learn a whole new set of skills, but I have this intuition about science that lots of people just don't have. So yes, very helpful, but had to learn how to communicate and write in a way that would allow me to tap into that, I guess is one way to put it.
Interesting. So, and then in the context of your interactions with both your colleagues in philosophy, but also colleagues like the scientists, again, do you think that sort of perspective gives you the ability to interact at a different level than someone who's purely a philosopher from the start would be able to do with other scientists, for example?
Yeah, I mean, one part of it is just being comfortable with the terminology. In medicine and in many scientific fields, there's just a vocabulary and a language that's used And if you have someone who's coming from a philosophy background and they hear, you know, even if it's just like hypertension or, you know, any kind of chaperone protein, just they could get a little more nervous about not knowing what's going on, where if you've heard this language a lot, you know, and it's just kind of, you've been immersed in it, you're more comfortable. I mean, scientists are probably a little, I mean, sometimes they're curious about, you know, sort of like, why did I go from medicine to philosophy? They might be a little more open to listening to me initially. Of course, I need to be smart about that because each field is very different, and the terms used in my field are not terms that scientists are familiar with, so I have to be super clear right away, because some scientists have really bad experiences with philosophers, and they're sort of like, you know, yeah, I'll give you a little bit of time to tell me what you do. I'm interested, but like if you don't convince them in a minute or two, you kind of, it's gone. Yeah, so being mindful of how to keep things clear, and yeah, there's a little bit of an advantage in the sense scientists might be a little more willing to talk to me, and yeah, I can kind of see from both sides a little more easily. I can kind of see why, I mean, I totally understand why scientists would be frustrated with some types of philosophy. I'm frustrated with some types of it. And then I can see why I can see what philosophy has to offer too. Mm-hmm. And I see, I mean, one kind of funny thing that I have said before is, I was talking with a physician about causation. So causation and explanation are the two main topics that I work on. I was talking to a physician about causation, and he said one of the causes of lung cancer is having lungs. And I said, you know, like, so when I say that, usually it gets a couple of laughs. People think it sounds silly, but being able to say why is challenging. And you know, philosophers, if they're trained well, they're trained to say why, and they can engage with that. But as a scientist, sometimes you kind of know you have the right intuition, but you haven't always broken it down. So yeah, I can see how and when and why philosophy of science is helpful, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes scientists can get tripped up on small things that if you're familiar with these long debates about causation, it's easy I think, to kind of help. And once you say it, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot to learn about moving back and forth. It's kind of how I do my work too. It's got to be like back and forth. Mm-hmm. What's the philosophical question? What's the science that is relevant to it? What's the science, and like what's the philosophical point that it helps make?
Can I unpack one thing you mentioned? It might require you to sort of define a bit more what is your particular field versus the general field of philosophy. But you said that you know, for science to benefit from philosophy, they need to do X, and you need to do X, which is communication. But can you give me sort of a general feeling from your perspective? How is it that science would be beneficial? Sorry, philosophy beneficial for science, and particularly philosophy of science per se, and then you know what the interaction might look like, but also what is philosophy of science versus other areas of philosophy.
Yeah, so I mean, one way to answer the question is to suggest that there's actually a kind of gradation between science and philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. So sometimes when I describe what I do to people, or sometimes when I describe my field to people, I say, look, philosophy of neuroscience is like theory of neuroscience. If you've ever heard of theoretical physics, philosophy of physics, it's almost the same thing for many topics. So for scientists, that can sometimes be helpful because they're familiar with theoretical physics. Philosophy of physics is so similar in terms of many of the topics and many of the orientations. And I also think that many scientists, they're doing philosophy, right? A lot of theoretical neuroscience, I think you could say this about. And so many scientists are already doing this. And philosophers of science can help because they're doing it too. And philosophy of science is a kind of subfield of all of philosophy, of course. It's philosophers who are studying kind of what science is. For me, it's like the scientific method is how I think about it. Being able to say, like, what is the scientific method? I say it in kind of singular, but there's many different methods. So it's, you know, how are scientists able to give us our best understanding of the world? What are the methods they use? What's the, you know, what's so fancy, and what's the kind of secret recipe in that gives you this understanding of the world? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so scientific method, a lot of philosophers of science are focused on that. And for me, it involves, it's kind of like a methodological orientation. Sometimes epistemology is a word that's used in my field. It's like capturing knowledge, you know, what's scientific knowledge and how do you get it?
So your focus on causality and explanation has gotten a lot of, generated a lot of interest in your work. And I'm wondering how, I mean, before I met you, certainly causality in terms of when it's used in neuroscience kind of gets thrown out without really thinking about what it means. And same explanation and prediction, all these other kind of terms that are similar but not necessarily identical. So when you had interactions where you push that issue, how's the receptivity been? Does it vary by sort of field of science, or does people seem receptive to thinking about these terms in a different way? You know, how do you get that point across to them so that it's not used sort of willy-nilly, it's actually has a very specific meaning?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think part of my approach, I mean, really a good philosopher of science, in my opinion, takes scientists very seriously. We view them as experts. They know what they're doing. In fact, I often view part of my job is talking to other philosophers about why science is our best understanding of the world. Mm-hmm. And it's different from hanging out in your armchair thinking really hard about the way it could be, should be, in a way that's kind of like sometimes viewed as before science, you do this special armchair stuff. For me, it's like, look, you know, science is our best understanding of the world. What are they up to? So usually I think, and really I think about this in terms of just being an academic, there's a kind of important humility involved where there's a first step of, if I don't quite understand where you're coming from, I'm gonna work to try to figure it out. And then in some cases where scientists are kind of at odds, or where I do feel comfortable pushing, then it will sort of be like, well, is this really the best way to understand causation? Because over here, you guys do it differently. And over here, you have this nice goal that you reach, but here you can't quite get at it, or just the context is different. So I think what's probably important for, at least for me, the way I approach it is, the important default is, what are you doing? I need to understand it, as opposed to, Hume told me what causation was like, you know, I read about, that was like the 18th century, what's going on with this, you know, intervention that you're doing, or optogenetics, like, so, yeah, and I guess a kind of a scientific, I mean, the way that I think scientists approach it often is there's a kind of goal they're interested in, and there's methods that serve that goal. So sometimes what I can do is I can say, okay, if these are your goals, and you have all of these methods, it seems like this one gets you to your goal, but like, I don't see how this other one does, so can you help me with that? But yeah, it's very much like, you know, that's cool that Aristotle said some stuff about causality, but scientists are successful here and in this context, and here's what they're doing. How are they doing that? If Aristotle's conception of causation doesn't make sense of this, well, we need to revise our conception of causality. And that's what's been done in the philosophy of science. There's really robust accounts of causation, and some of them we'll discuss later today, but they're very much focused on scientific methodology.
Cool. I want to pause my inquiry right now to see if there's other questions for other people here. Anybody?
Well, I'll ask you a quick question. I just did, in part of my PhD in education, and my interest is in educational neuroscience. I did a deep dive into phenomenology, you know, both a philosophy and a methodology, research methodology. When you mentioned you had to learn the philosophy, I'm wondering what were the things that were, what aspects of philosophy were emphasized to you, or which are you most interested in and maybe drawn towards?
When I say that I had to learn how to do philosophy, I'm talking, I guess, about a number of things. One of them is the kind of the writing style, which is, you know, a kind of common way of communicating in our field is papers, and this is similar to kind of presentations that we would give. There's kind of a culture, right, in every field about what topics people care about, and then how do you put together a publication that's sufficient for getting into journals and that kind of counts as something that you're making like a contribution in the field. I gravitated towards the topics of causation and explanation, and what I did is I looked for work that that was very successful in, I guess, my opinion, in terms of being novel, adding something new to the current literature, being clear, being, I guess, important in some way, and positive. Sometimes in arguments in philosophy, it's just a negative one where it's like, Hume didn't do the right thing, and I'll tell you 8 reasons why. And in other cases, it's like, well, Hume didn't do the right thing, but I'll tell you what is the right way, like, to understand this. So part of it was finding work that I thought was really making contributions, and trying to figure out what the features were, and also work that really captured science well, and then just getting better at writing was this, you know, is this long process of just like working at it. But yeah, that's a little bit about the process. Is there anything more kind of in particular that I didn't kind of come to? Or?
No, I think that's pretty sufficient to answer my inquiry. Thanks a lot.
I have a question.
Please.
You mentioned, you know, the practice of medicine having a gold standard, and it was difficult in that kind of culture to question why or how it's practiced. I might argue that in science, that's very much the case as well, that we have certain gold standards, methodologies, or approaches, and from what I can see, it could be hard to change or question those accepted gold standards. And I wondered if you could comment more on it, if you feel that's the case, and to what extent maybe philosophy could help.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's really helpful. In my field too, and I do totally agree, in some academic fields, there is sort of like, here's how we do things. You know, you can't do it too outside crazy, but also do it a little crazy new, or else you're just doing what everyone else is doing. I guess the way that I saw the difference is in research, even if it's natural science research, you are expected to do something that's new or novel and to give a new answer to a question. In medicine, I don't need to do anything new. I need to learn the way to do the appendectomy the way that I am supposed to do the appendectomy, and there's like, sometimes there's just like a spreadsheet and, you know, here's what I need to follow. Now, it's really difficult to learn everything involved in working in these really complicated areas of medicine, but there's no novelty really. I I mean, you get a new patient and you have to figure out what's going on. Maybe they present in a way that's a little different, but the novelty isn't quite there or expected. Where the way I understand some of the work in natural science, the publisher perish is what's new? Like, what's your new thing? And for us, the way I think about it in philosophy is, I mean, we have to do the same thing. I can't just say something that's already been said. It has to be novel. And there's something that's both like exciting about this and scary. Some friends I have in academia worry that they might not have another new idea for a paper or a publication. Like, what if that was the last big one? And I think if you like that space, then the kind of academic research, even if it's natural sciences, I think that's just a very different feel than here is a really complicated, prostate surgery, and it's going to take you 8 hours, and your full attention needs to be on this. And there's millions of, where, it's a different kind of problem space to work in. So I really have grown to enjoy and just thrive and kind of really love this way of being pushed. Can I, what's the new answer to this big question? And that takes longer. So yeah, so part of it is a time scale thing. In clinical practice, it's like you get a patient, figure it out by, if it's a clinical visit, it could be short, where in natural science, you could be puzzling over something in my field for months or longer.
Decades.
Yeah, decades. But it's some people really like one or the other, and so part of it is like a personality difference. But I do appreciate. I mean, there's a sense also in my field you need to do something new, but not too new. You can't you still need to cite a little bit of Hume maybe sometimes, or not Hume, but you need to be aware. I mean, one thing we see is there's a paper that is very novel and it's actually quite good, but if you don't show that you're aware of the current research in the space and kind of connect up to it a bit, the reviewers get kind of grumpy about that. Yeah. But then of course, if you connect it up totally to the literature, but it doesn't seem novel enough, they're like, this isn't very new, you can't. So it is this interesting, and you all apply for grants much more. I wonder if there are kind of similar, it's new, but not too, or show me you've done some work that suggests this works, but also it's got to transform everything.
I know that very well. People online, any questions? Yeah. Don't be shy.
I'll pop another one. Okay. Speaking of novel, I imagine that your field, philosophy of science, is bursting with new conversation around applications of AI, and so I wonder, without maybe getting too granular about it, what sparks your interest in that rapidly burgeoning field and development? Let's just roll that your way.
AI has, of course, exploded in terms of interest, and a number of philosophers, of course, have engaged in these debates and get recruited, sometimes for ethical reasons, interest in the ethics of AI, and in other cases, the kind of technical aspects of it. And I guess what's interesting about this is you see an interest in philosophy to sometimes give the technical scientific method under the hood approach or ethics. My work typically doesn't involve much ethics or bioethics, but in this case, philosophers are helpful with respect to both. For the work that I do, a lot of the AI is distinct from causation and getting kind of causal information about the world. So it's a little bit outside my kind of area of expertise. But there are many philosophers of data science who are inside of California and basically all over. We're also seeing the need for philosophers to get more training in these areas. There's many more job openings. I guess what's nice about it is you see an appreciation from people in my field of the kind of practical, the need for philosophers to give some kind of advice or input on practical matters. So yeah, there's just so much more to come. Sure. And yeah, I think it will be pretty clearly an important space to watch.
I'd like to come back to that in a minute, but I want to let Jack jump in. Jack, please.
Hi, Lawrence. Sorry if I'm sounding a little bit tinny. I had kind of, I guess, maybe a bit of an open question. As I learned kind of the tools that we use in this space, one of the questions that I had a discussion with a member of our team, Patrick, was this idea that we commonly are using generative models like the virtual brain to try and have some functional understanding of what the brain is doing, given that we are recording essentially an observation from outside of the head. And maybe as a bit of an open question, Randy, this probably has already been done, is kind of what I assume. But how do we know that when we build these generative models to try and predict what's happening in the brain, that the model parameters and structures that we're using are actually reflective of the underlying anatomy? Because in practice, it's often like, oh, we'll make an alteration, see if it fits the observations better. But I guess it might not necessarily address the question of, are our assumptions accurate in this case?
This might be a nice question for Randy to answer.
No, you're the he asked you the question, I think. Did he not?
Does it sound like a bit more of a scientific question?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Yeah.
I can jump in after.
Okay. Let me try and assuage your concerns a bit, Jack, but also want to make sure that it's not a perfect. You can never be certain. To be clear, the approximations in the model are sort of best guesses in terms of what parameters and what the state variables would be that correspond to biophysical phenomena. So the Hodgkin-Huxley model is like one of the classics for neural architectures, and it's based on hardcore physiology, but the model is a model, so there'll be things missing. The question is, does it explain anything, and can you use that then to generate new insights into the system? And that's sort of where you determine whether the model is really useful in pushing that envelope. So, in TDB, for example, we've got, I don't know how many now, 32 different versions for mean field approximations, all of which have different assumptions underlying how the dynamics are generated. But as long as you know what those assumptions are, then the model can be useful. But that's kind of a decision for the theoretician as to which model do I want to adopt so that I can understand something, or at least try to understand something about the system I'm trying to model. So it's never perfect, and that's the nature of the model. But it's the question of let's get back to that idea: is the model useful? And that's where I think it is usually.
Oh, yeah, sorry, and maybe I should have rephrased my question a little more generally. I was more so, I guess, interested in trying to see maybe what Lauren's opinion is on how does one logically test assumptions of, an abstracted rule of some observation.
So I think a number of comments that might help are that in philosophy of science, it's common for us to think of not just the kind of model that a scientist has, but also what they want to do with it and what their kind of goals are. So, and we distinguish some of the goals. So sometimes with a model or with other types of theories, we think that scientists are interested in explanation, as Randy mentioned. We distinguish that in many cases from prediction. And we also distinguish both of those from describing something, in this case, mere description, or classification sometimes fits into the description category. So if you want to predict something, you don't need causal information. Causal information can give you predictions, but you don't need causality to be able to predict things. So if you have a model and your goal is prediction, it's not the case that you need causal information. But for us, explanation, in many cases, it's the view is that most explanations that scientists provide are causal explanations. So you need causality to give an explanation. And in this case, it's like causality, as you're alluding to and mentioning, like in the world. So your model should be capturing causality in the world and essentially what those relationships are. What's causing what causal factors are productive of something. So if the scientist is interested in predictions, they need not reflect or capture causality in the world, because you can get predictions from information about correlations and so on. If you're describing stuff in the world or classifying, you definitely don't need, we can classify all sorts of stuff, and that can be useful for many different goals, but you don't need causality to do that. So I guess part of what I'm suggesting is we kind of break it down in terms of what's the goal the scientist has, and then these goals are different, and there's different assumptions involved in reaching them, different things you need. So if one of the goals is explanation, and it's in fact causal explanation, another thing we do that's a little different is we say, okay, if the scientist is interested in explaining something in that has to do with the brain, a behavior, we want to know exactly what it is they want to explain in order to see if the model is doing that well. And part of what that involves is being super clear about the explanatory target. What exactly does the scientist want to explain? So for us, you can't give an explanation unless you say exactly what it is you want to explain, or we can't really judge them unless you say. And in many cases, it's easy for scientists to talk past each other if they refer to an explanatory target, but it's not precise enough, because the contrast isn't always super clear. And part of what this alludes to is the sense in which we often view explanations as kind of piecemeal, right? You say, here's this system. Maybe it's like, you can point to it in the world, but there's different parts of it you might want to explain, and different types of causes that are going to matter for the different targets, as opposed to a kind of theory of everything, like the whole enchilada explanation for blah, and then also there's debates about how to define the explanatory target. In consciousness, it's like, well, what exactly is the target you want to explain? In many other phenotypes and traits, it's a very similar conversation. Like, how do you define the thing you want to explain? Because if you define it differently, then there could be kind of miscommunication, and different types of models do or don't matter depending on the target. So yeah, we break it down in terms of the goals of the scientists, and then there's different assumptions and reasoning strategies depending on the goals. And the context also, differs. Maybe there's ways of collapsing variables that you can get away with in some contexts, backgrounding certain things, where in others it doesn't quite work. But yeah, that's kind of part of the approach we would use to answering that question, and thinking about, and for us, explanation is this special thing. It's different from a colloquial use of explanation, like explaining how to bake a pie, or why I feel a certain way. Explanation is a bit more constrained. It's like giving understanding about the world in a way that has to be kind of rigorous, and there's an attempt to clarify the model, what's the model of scientific explanation? How do you know when you have one? It's special, and it's different from mere description or prediction. So okay, what's the special stuff that makes something an explanatory, a really explanatory model? or a legitimately explanatory one.
Well, thank you for your answer, Lauren. I think I have to think more. I'm gonna just end it at that.
That's okay. Any other questions from the group?
Yeah, I have one.
Please,
So that discussion about gold standards and stuff got me thinking about how we present our confidence in the findings that we have, especially new findings. Like we use statistics, and everybody knows that we have a p-value of 0.05 that is like past that we can say we confidently have a new finding, and we're supposed to report it as like, this is my great new finding. But if I have a p-value of 0.04, I'm doing that, and 0.06, some reviewers might say like, don't even report that, say it's not a finding at all. But I'm not 100% more confident. I'm 2% more confident in my finding. So how do you think about reporting confidence honestly? Because 0.04 is not that confident. 0.06 is like, for me, I'm equally confident.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point, and part of what it relates to is the sense in which in science and in many domains, there's a kind of line you need to draw, and you can give some types of good reasons for why there needs to be a line, but exactly where you put it is kind of debatable. So if you think of anemia, the standards for when you count as anemic actually differ from country to country, not like a ton, but you could be anemic in the US but fine in Canada or vice versa. And I in fact think that there are differences across these two. So there does need to be a line, but exactly where you draw it is up for debate. And yeah, I think if you shift it a little down or you shift it a little up, things wouldn't necessarily change that much. But it's more like we need some kind of division. I think in other cases, it's easier for there to be a division when things are less of a graded. In some cases, for phenomena in the world, there's less of a gradation. So I guess it's actually kind of interesting to think when these cases present. Pregnancy might be something where an individual is either pregnant or they're not. There's like not an in-between. So one way to think about it is like variables that are either binary, like you can only have a binary yes or no, or there's a continuous kind of aspect to it. In cases where you can give a kind of binary, a reason for there being a kind of binary understanding of the variable, it's easier for maybe there's more of a division that feels less arbitrary. But yeah, it's going to be kind of an issue, I think, whenever we're dealing with a continuous variable and we're trying to decide where the line should be drawn.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, so you think that it's good to have a line there? We shouldn't just talk about it as a continuous variable? Like, I feel like it might be helpful to report it sometimes and say like, look, I'm not crossed the line, but I'm as confident as if I had, you know?
Yeah, I think if it's close, right? I mean, it's the same way with anemia, right? If you're not exactly anemic, but you're really close, the doctor might say, look, you haven't met the threshold, but
You still have a problem.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I think that's a good point.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Along those lines, I was wondering, you have written papers about causality in social sciences, for example, and I've read the paper, and I'm just wondering if you could just sort of talk about how these principles of causality and explanation start being adopted, or how they can be useful in social science, where there's a combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches that aren't, give the guy thing you might have like in a dish of cells, for instance, in basic biology.
So there's some really interesting puzzles that have to do with causation that you see show up in science and in other domains as well. And one of them is downward causation. Whenever we think there's a higher level cause and a lower level effect, people can really worry about that. It looks mysterious. Downward causation to a lot of people, scientists, everyday life, they're sort of like, that's either not real, or it's spooky, or something's wrong. Yeah. And I think that some of this has to do with a very reductive notion of causation in the world that's very common in science and everywhere else, everyday life too. And the reductive view is like, well, the way things work is they're made up of lower level stuff, and that lower level stuff produces the higher level thing. So there's lower level gears in the machine, and they produce the behavior of the car, the engine. So there's this very, and it relates to this notion of mechanism in neuroscience, neurobiology, biology, where it's suggested in many cases that if you want to really understand the brain or give a real explanation, you need a mechanism. And a mechanism is the stuff down below. So if you want to talk about society, that looks like it's up here, If you want to talk about the environment, then that looks mysterious because it could look like downward causation. However, of course, we think, and we have good reason to think, that in many cases there are higher level causes that have really important causal influences on stuff that we think of as at lower scales. So even in medicine, if you think of like racism and the impact that it has on blood pressure in patients or cortisol levels, it's a very, in my view, clear example of what some might say downward causation. The way that you treat someone, the way that their environment, right? It's the same, like, does your environment influence the patient? Sort of like, if you look at these carefully, I mean, we really need to come to terms with the fact that this is, if we have evidence for causality, this stuff is causal too. Yeah. But in medicine, there's often a kind of reductive focus, so we're not as good at paying attention to the social things. So there's newer movements in some medical schools, they call it structural competency, where the push is, we want our medical students, we want our physicians to not just think, what's your underlevel biology, but what's your life like? Not just you didn't take your medication because you're not compliant, but do you have health insurance? What is the social structure that you live in, and how does that matter for your health? And so what's really nice about having a background in causation is you can see with a basic causal framework, higher level causation is not mysterious at all. For me, I think of causation in terms of control. And so, if the higher level variable gives you control over the lower level one, you have causation, And we have just, so part of what I suggest in that paper is, you can use this analysis and framework to capture how social structure is a real, genuine cause. And it's essentially pushing back on that mysterious downward causality. And so part of what you can do with philosophy of science is to say, this is not mysterious, and here's why. Yeah, but it's, we have to it suggests working on that reductive assumption.
Great. Good. Thank you, Lauren. We have to move on.